I'm Adam Bandt, I'm the federal member for Melbourne, and I'm also the Greens science spokesperson. I don't have a university background in science. I'm probably a walking advertisement for the failure of career guidance in this country. I did science all the way through high school and at first year uni as well, and then when I was looking for a degree to choose, I sought advice of people and they said, oh no, if you want a generalist degree and you don't know what you want to do, go and do law instead of doing science. You know, my hope is that the next time someone like me comes along, they get advice to do a science degree rather than do a law degree.
So you attended the Science March. What's your general thoughts on it?
Oh, I thought the Science March was fantastic. It's seeing thousands and thousands of people out on the street, not out of their own self-interest, but for the public interest, to say we need to respect research, we need secure funding for science, we need to stop the attacks on the legitimacy of science, but also make sure that, including in Australia, science is kind of the place that you want to go into to start a career and have a secure job all the way through. All of those things are just vital. And science has been under attack. Every time the federal budget gets into trouble, governments seem to have no problems dipping into the science and research budget to try and balance it. And the thing is, that's short-sighted. And it means that science as a vocation in Australia becomes less secure and less stable. And even if the funding isn't ultimately cut, the fact that there's kind of this axe hanging over people's heads and it's even being discussed means people would look around and say, well, maybe I shouldn't choose Australia as a place to begin or continue my science career. So coming out, and of course on the back of Donald Trump's sort of anti-science statements and funding cuts, sending this strong message now, just absolutely vital. It's kind of heartwarming to see so many people who might otherwise just be, preferred to get on with their own research coming out onto the streets. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of communication with the public, one of the things that really worries me is that if we have a decline or a continued decline in scientific literacy amongst the public, then that's actually a worry for democracy, right? It's a worry for progress and it's a worry for democracy, because unless you have an educated public and a highly educated public that's able to critically assess what they're being told by their politicians, what the media is telling them, then you remove the possibility of dialogue, right? You end up with people with the attacks on science being able to take root in a way that they just shouldn't, because people don't necessarily have the tools to challenge it. And so when newspapers decide that they're going to declare war on climate science or whatever it might be at that particular time, then unless you've got a public that's got good BS detectors and a good understanding of sort of the scientific method, then politicians and those in power are going to get away with a lot. But worse, it's going to make scientific progress much more difficult, because you need a public that accepts that you need to invest in and trust scientists and researchers, and that might mean, yes, working on a project that doesn't bear tangible dividends for a while, perhaps not ever. Not everything should be tied to whether it can make money, because astronomy tends not to have immediate commercial impacts, but it's vital, right? And so you need to have a public that understands the importance of long-term investing as well as applied research. So that is absolute, like that level of communication is vital, but also within sciences and between sciences. I mean, pushing for open access of to data, to findings, and not putting artificial money barriers in front of people who are trying to get their research published and the like is absolutely vital. So we're only going to progress as a society if we have an open and shared and equal sharing of scientific discovery. If it ends up only being done for money, then we're in trouble. Yes, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be business and science connected, of course there should, but if everything comes down to whether or not it makes a buck immediately, we're going to cut ourselves off at the knees when it comes to science in this country and in the world. Stable funding is just vital. The first big connection I had, I guess, with scientists and researchers rallying in the streets was back in the 2010 Parliament, when there was the prospect that a few $100 million was going to come out of the NHMRC budget to help balance the books. And thousands of scientists and researchers organised, got together in their lab coats on the steps of the State Library, like the March for Science, the Science March, and managed to stop the government from doing it, right? And can I tell you, sitting there as Parliament, talking to the government was terrified, was absolutely terrified by all these scientists and researchers coming out, because usually they're sitting behind their desks or in their labs, and all of a sudden they're out rallying, that was my sort of first connection with it, and even just the threat of funding being cut, even though it didn't actually happen because the scientists beat it off, the threat of funding being cut meant a lot of people said, well, this isn't a stable place for me to conduct my research. Maybe I'll go somewhere else, to another country. And then, like I've seen it under government after government, you see the increase, the national collaborative research infrastructure funding being used, and future fellowships funding got held hostage during the government's negotiations over higher education reform, and the Liberal government said, if you don't pass my bill, I'm going to cut funding to some of these other projects. And we saw NCRIS funding being extended from 1 year to 2 years at a time. You can't make decisions. You can't make decisions as a community if we're going to hold funding for infrastructure, for future fellowships, for ARC, for NHMRC, for CSIRO, at the whim of every budget. Like, we need to start talking about much, much longer funding cycles so that people feel like, oh, I could put down roots for this particular project here in Australia and know that even if the government changes, my particular area of work isn't up in the air. And at the moment, I don't know that we have that. I mean, it's not as bad as the US, but in many ways, some of the cuts that they're getting in the US now, we had a version of those over the last few years. A lot of good signs at the Science March. I think that was one of the best things about it. And one of the tweets that I saw after it said, "Here's how it should be. Scientists, experts say there's a problem. Politicians, non-experts then say, oh well, let's debate a solution." How it is at the moment is scientists say there's a problem, politicians say let's debate whether there's a problem, right? And we see that going on with something that's close to my heart, which is the science of climate change. And but just in general, I think there needs to be a much greater respect when the scientific community, who's got some pretty rigorous self-assessment processes, right, and comes and says, look, here's actually, having been through various processes of peer review, here's what we think is going on in this particular area. It should be incumbent on politicians to then say, right, well, we accept that, we're going to accept that and try and work together now to find a solution. And that solution might not be always the one that the scientists suggest, because there might be a pile of other factors as well that aren't necessarily strictly scientific, but it's got to have that scientific and evidence foundation to start with. And at the moment, too often that's just not happening. Scientists and researchers have to keep speaking up. The Science March was fantastic because for first time since the Discoveries Need Dollars campaign, but certainly the first time nationwide, I think, you had people whose jobs might not have been directly under threat, but coming out saying, we are marching in the public interest to maintain science as place as a key plank of what it means to be a smart and a good society. And you had people, just general members of the public, coming out as well, right? That is vital. That is absolutely vital. And I know that a lot of people would just prefer to get on with doing their research, but I guess what I would say to them is, having been sort of seen the system from the inside now as a member of Parliament for a few years, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And there are lots of people patrolling the halls of Parliament in Canberra saying, oh, we want this slice of the budget, we want that piece of the pie. And they're very loud and they're very powerful. And what happens with scientists is that scientists end up not wanting to participate in that debate, and so they're the ones who get the budget cut because they haven't been up there sort of speaking to making their voices heard and making politicians quake in their boots in the way that the pokies lobby might, or the way that the mining companies might. Now, the louder that we make the science voice in Australia, and the more that politicians come to understand, oh, actually, maybe if I cut the science budget, I might lose some votes, or I might lose my seat, that's when they'll start paying attention. And my hope is that we get to a point in Australia where politicians treat the science budget like they treat the defence budget, where no one would ever dream of cutting it because they know it's electoral suicide. Like that's the point that we need to get to in Australia with science. And when scientists and researchers stand up and say, no, look, we're coming together across disciplines, across areas of interest to say, actually, science is a public good, that's when people start paying attention. In the past, I think one of the things that's changed the way that humanity thinks about itself, I think, has to have been going to the moon. And I think that I know that at the time that it was tied up a lot with Cold War rhetoric and the fights that were going on there between Americans and the Russians and the like. But one of the things that it enabled us to do was actually participate in a global endeavour and feel some common sense of shared humanity, and then kind of reflect back on our planet in a particular way, in a way that we kind of haven't been able to before. And even if you just think about that photo of the globe, right, that we all now, if you're born after a certain age like me, you just take it for granted. I can't remember a time when I didn't see that picture of the Earth sort of rising, I guess, if you like. And but hearing accounts from people who are saying, well, you know, when we saw that, that meant a bit of a shift in the way that we started thinking about ourselves and each other. I think its contribution to politics, to the way we think about ourselves in that respect, has been absolutely profound. So, I mean, there's again, one of the best signs from the science march was someone holding a thing saying, "Got the plague? No, neither have I. Thanks science for that." So I think there's any number of contributions that science has made to public health that I think, again, we just kind of take for granted. I'm particularly excited about what's happening in the energy space. And when you think about it, like the advances of the steam engine were pretty big for their time and helped fundamentally shift the way that we perceive the world. Neil Stephenson's written a great series of books about this that just are fantastic. But I think, but when you think about it, energy was kind of at the heart of that, right? It's all of a sudden we've worked out how to burn things and turn that into motive force, and then discoveries of electricity. And when you think about how all those two things combine, pretty amazing stuff, revolutionised the way that we think about ourselves as a species. And I feel that there's some similar stuff going on with energy at the moment, and we need to, because of the climate challenge, we've got to become a zero pollution society by mid-century at the absolute latest, right? That's just, there's no negotiation on that point. In fact, it probably needs to happen earlier. But it's exciting to see the technology that has been developed that's actually going to make that a reality. And seeing what is happening with the development of solar PV, for example, has kind of mirrored, and the cost of renewables generally has kind of mirrored Moore's law, kind of and then now you've got storage coming out as well. And I think the cost of storage is just coming down massively, that you are going to find a completely, science will again underpin a new way that we relate to ourselves, to each other as a species, in the same way as those fundamental changes that came with the steam engine. I think it's sort of, and initial discoveries and applications of electricity, you're seeing it happen again. So I get really excited when I go to an energy storage conference or see some new solar PV being developed. And at Melbourne Uni, Monash Uni, they're advanced now in organic solar cells, printable solar cells that you can print on any surface. Now, imagine when you don't have to have a solar panel installed on your roof because you can just print straight onto the surface of the corrugated iron, and that is your solar panel, right? And University of Newcastle's got microscopic solar cells essentially in paint. I worked out how to put it in a version of paint. When we commercialise that, if you could commercialise that and paint on the side of every building, like every wall becomes a power source. Like there's just amazing stuff that's there, and yet this is the stuff the government cuts the funding to, right? And so you just look at the prospects of what's we're on the brink of and what we're discovering at the moment, and that makes me quite excited. The Greens have got a charter, right, that underpins us, and the opening words of the charter in the first paragraph, it basically says never have, as a human species, have we had the scientific and technological capacity to solve so many of the world's problems as we've got now. And I think that's right. I think science and technology is essential to dealing with not just climate change, but a range of the world's problems. The problem is that those solutions and that knowledge is unequally distributed at the moment, and it's not always put to the public good. And so I think that to make us a more equal society, but also a more sustainable society, we need to up the contribution and the spending and the support for science and research, but also up the public discussion of it so that it becomes a public good rather than being unequally distributed.
There seems to be a bit of a tension between existing financial interests of big corporations and also the financial interests of people who want to get cheaper energy, regardless of the environmental impact, through the use of sustainable technology like solar. It looks as though it's got the headroom to become a lot cheaper than other more sort of old options.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so if depends which state of Australia you're in, but if you're in Victoria at the moment, you sell your solar into the grid, you get between probably 6 and 12 cents for that, for the electricity that's being produced from the solar panels during the middle of the day. Power companies get to buy that and on-sell that to your neighbour for 30 odd cents, right? So the system at the moment isn't geared towards, as well as it could be, geared towards people taking matters in their own hands and shifting to renewables, but despite that, people are doing it anyway, right? People understand that it needs to happen and want to see it happen. Once storage and domestic sort of behind the meter batteries become cheap enough, which is probably only going to be in the next couple of years, so that renewables plus solar domestically is now cheaper than will be cheaper than buying off the grid. So South Australia, the energy network operator there says they reckon it'll happen next year, as soon as next year. Then the question is who maintains the grid? Does everyone who can afford it jump off, get their own solar and their own storage? Who maintains the grid? What do you do if you live in an apartment and you don't have rooftop space? What do you do if you can't afford the upfront costs of a solar panel and storage? Who's going to maintain who's going to look after the grid? And at the moment, no one is planning any of these. And these problems that we're facing at the moment, they're engineering problems, right? Like how could we create a grid in Australia that's run on renewables, but that we make sure the lights stay on? It's an engineering problem now, rather than sort of a question of technological capacity. We've got all the capacity, now we just need to engineer the systems to make it work. And my worry is that no one's looking at it again, because of the kind of the debasement of science. Like no one sits at the top and says, oh, from an engineering point of view, you should do this, and this, and you should do this here and that here. That's not happening at the moment, and we need to sort of shift the mindset again.
What are your thoughts on, there's a number of people who think that biotech, nanotech and AI specifically will have some huge impact in the future. Have you thought much about those? Have you got any sort of...
Yeah, I do, and I've been reading a lot about all of that, plus also the role of algorithms in decision making, and which we kind of, has crept under the radar in over a decade or so, but is now determining a lot of what we see next on Facebook, or what gets pitched to us. And and increasingly, as we're seeing with Centrelink at the moment in the government, is underpinning government decision makings. You know, they're cutting people off payments based on data matching from two separate sources, and then making some inferences about how much people will be earning, and then if the algorithm comes out against you, you lose your payment, right? Even though you might, but it doesn't actually do any investigation of your factual circumstances, it's just based on a whole pile of assumptions. So all of this, I think, are kind of being ignored by politics, right? And I'm not saying that politicians should necessarily control it, or it needs to be brought under government control. That's probably never going to happen, but we should think about what it means for the future of work, and whether or not, are we going to experience higher unemployment than we have in the past because of the automation of a lot of jobs that aren't just blue-collar jobs anymore, they're going to be white-collar jobs. So does it mean we should look, what some people are saying is, well, let's accept that there's going to be high unemployment, but let's have universal income instead. And so accept that the machines will do much more of the work, but and you've even got people, I think it's Bill Gates, talking about a robot tax, I think, right? And I don't know that I agree with that, but at least he's saying, well, this is what's going to happen, this is the impact it's going to have on the world of work. Let's bring it. I don't feel like it's being discussed at the moment. From my view, I'm in two minds, and I've seen some economists who say, look, actually, the level of unemployment isn't necessarily going to be a lot higher this time, and look at the history of computerisation over the last 15, 20 years. It hasn't resulted in massive unemployment in the way that you might think. It's just resulted in people doing different kinds of jobs. So don't worry, it's not going to be different. Whereas others are arguing, no, there's something fundamentally different this time. When it comes to outsourcing of decisions and then AI, you put those things together, maybe it's going to be very, very different this time. So I don't know. I'm looking at the evidence at the moment, and I'm thinking, well, maybe it's not as bad as people are saying it's going to be. But then you look at the trends and you think maybe it will be. So I don't know. That's fence sitting, but I haven't worked it out yet. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it.